Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about good books and not Wheel of Time today. So, if you're new here, welcome. I'm Raf. I talk about books and sometimes other stuff. And if you've been here for a while, well, thanks for sticking with me. I know it must be hard. And today, I want to talk about The Dragon Waiting by John Ford. That's something I just finished, and it's great, and I want to talk about it. So we'll do this the usual way. I'll give us a quick review kind of thing, spoiler free and everything, and then I'll go into some of the themes that I think make this one really worth your while, and bits and pieces that I'm trying to explain and point out about it. And you can, judge yourself whether you want to listen to that as well or not. As long as you go and read the book, I'm fine with all of that. All right, it's time to start this, and I'll start it by thanking one of my Patreon backers, Joe Byrne. This one's for you. I'm sorry it's not a bottle pop, but I don't have those at the moment because the shop didn't have them. So this one's for you. Cheers, my friend. And yes, if you want to be cheered personally, or even tell me what kind of beer to drink while talking about books, you can join the Patreon, but you don't have to. All the videos are here. Don't worry. All right. So, The Dragon Waiting by John M. Ford. From 1983, recently republished. Last year, and I know there's been a bit of I don't want to call it a hype because it's far from it, but there's other people that will start a buddy read, I think on Mike's Discord, or Liam on Liam's Lyceum said that he wants to do it next month. I was just, as usual, I suck at timing, so I'm already done with it. So maybe, if join one of those buddy reads. It is well worth your time. So what is this book, and what can I tell you about it without spoiling stuff, right? So, in short, it's a alternate history fantasy mix. It plays around in Europe in the 15th century with a very much stronger Byzantium and, events in England that have been immortalized by Shakespeare in Richard III. Because we're talking about Richard III and Henry the Fourth, I guess, and other Henrys around it. There's too many Henrys in there, but that's English history for you. And it is, that's basically your subject matter, and the question on how these different, this alternative to history would look like. It's like all alternate histories, it basically takes one or two, or maybe three, but mostly one or two key events in history and figures out it tries to extrapolate what could happen if they would have gone differently, right? And then it adds a dollop of fantasy or supernatural elements to it. That's all I'm gonna say here for the spoiler-free part, because some of that's spoilery, but it's very clear that there is supernatural stuff going on here as well. And in that regard, it is very much something that people who like the books of Tim Powers, for example, might really enjoy, and I personally do that. I don't know if you've read the Anubis Gates or Declare or something like that. We're not talking about On Stranger Tides. That one has its good sides, much more than the movie. But, my point is, if you've, read some of that stuff, you're familiar with what you're kind of getting yourself into. Taking weird, odd coincidences and stuff in history that really happened, and then just using a fantastical explanation to explain one of those big or smaller mysteries of or oddities in real world history. And that's what John Ford is doing here, and he's doing it excellently. So if you like all of that as a backdrop, and then want a classic adventure tale, which is exactly what this is, a classic adventure tale of the kind you might get with, your Alexandre Dumas stories, your Three Musketeers or Count of Monte Cristo, that kind of story, with all the swashbuckling and all the other bits and pieces included there, then this is very much your kind of book, and it is excellently written for that particular story style, and I cannot recommend it heartily enough. This is like really good shit. It's so much fun to read. It is exuberant, it is fast-paced, and it knows how to slow down at the right moments to give you that bit of emotional bittersweetness that you might want to have there as well. It does all of that fantastically well in a style that's very cinematic in a lot of ways, and very accessible and modern in that regard. However, it obviously plays around with a lot of historical references that you don't really need to know, but add that level of, enjoyment for those of us who have, for whatever reason, actually looked into history books, or have a passing interest in those aspects of history and culture. If you are one of those people, then yeah, you get like more out of it, but you don't have to. You can just like go, fuck yeah, there's people with guns riding around Europe, shooting at people, swashbuckling, doing weird things, and it does all of that wonderfully well in this, as I said, like very cinematic style that, for example, people who liked the Gentleman Bastards series would really enjoy, because there's a reason why Scott Lynch wrote the introduction for the republishing of last year. Yeah. So that's basically your quick review. A couple of really cool, slightly damaged but fascinating characters taking on the Byzantine Empire in around 1500. With added magics. Really cool shit. So go ahead and read it, and then we can all talk about bigger themes and stuff, shall we? Alright, I guess you're done reading. That's perfect. Now I want to look at a couple of things here about the dragon waiting, things that I find, of more general interest. And obviously, I want to start with something about the prose here. And that's the cinematic prose that I just mentioned. And the Scott Lynch thing, because I don't know if you've read The Gentleman Bastards. I've read the first one, Liza Lochlamora, a couple of times, and always got stuck with the second one because I couldn't be bothered to continue. But I will read them at some point. I promise. I already bought them, so I'm going to do that. If I extend that kind of courtesy to to Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson for 14 books, I can just as well do that for Scott Lynch and like 2 more novels at this point. So there we are. My point is, you can see a similar approach. When I said like a cinematic approach, I literally meant that. The novel that we have here, is written in individual scenes that are one after the other. There's no like through line in the way of having a narrator, whether it's like first person, second person, whatever you want. It's literally like scenes that could be just lined one after the other, like in a play or in a movie. I feel movie is the better point here, because there's all kinds of stuff going down that doesn't really work well on like a theater stage. But with the Richard III and like all these like King's tragedies by Shakespeare, as a clear influence, you can obviously see where that is also coming from. You have basically a cut. We don't get like a next cut kind of thing. It's just like change between scenes. We just like start with like the next sentence and you're in a different scene, which more establishes that idea of a movie where you just like blend into like the next one, have like a crossfade or whatever. But it does work like that. We just like are in a room, people show up, do something, talk, have a conversation, and go. And there is no real commentary or aspects to it that try to, give background and take the information and place it into like a larger context. There's no contextualization of the things that happen in those scenes. That part is left over to us, the reader, which once again is something that Scott Lynch, for example, adapts in The Gentleman Bastard. And I'm fine with that. Why do I think it works well here and didn't always work that well in Gentleman Bastards? I don't want to trash Gentleman Bastards here because it's been like 5 or 6 years since I last read it, so my memory's kind of dim on that one. But there's one major theme. We don't get any internal, like, look at any of the characters in Lies of Locke Lamora. We only get those scenes from the outside. But we do get a bit of, like, emotion, like, internal emotions and stuff in the Dragon Waiting, because while those scenes are basically, written like movie scenes, they are still slightly from, like, the perspective of one of the main characters in each of those scenes, one of the major characters, so we do get, like, some emotions pulled through. It's not always a lot, but it manages to give those scenes more of an emotional hit or emotional punch to it than other, like, very cinematic novels that just don't do that at all would do. That's where the real strength in this book lies for me, is the delicate addition, the delicate touch there in those scenes, that, like, bleeding through of emotions that we have there. It is very little, but it is there, and that's something that adds in a way that, say, for example, Lies of Locke Lamora can't really do. And I think it's important to look at that aspect because it's something that separates novel from film. And I'm always looking at, and we spoke about it last week when we spoke about Hollow by Brian Catling, right? The point is that we have, like, each form of media that we use for our art, whether it's music, whether it's sculpture, whether it's painting, whether it's film or novel, they have specific strengths and ways to touch our emotion, ways to provide meaning that are exclusive to them. And one of those exactly is, for the novel, is that way of giving us something of a look into the mind, into the motives, into the emotions of the characters in a way that movies can't really do. Yes, you can have, like, voiceovers, and most of the time that's really crap. Because that's exactly when you see, like, with a movie with voiceover narration, say in Blade Runner, which is horrible, in the old Blade Runner, like, it's the voiceovers that they thankfully cut out later on. But those kind of things where you have that kind of, like, one character's, like, narration as a voiceover from time to time to contextualize and give meaning, or, like, internal monologues and stuff onto it, they feel a bit out of place in a movie, because that's not how, that's basically when you take something from a novel and import it into a movie. And I guess we can tell because a lot of times that kind of thing shows up in movies that are adaptations of novels. So leaving that strength of the novel, giving us that internal view of characters from time to time, in whatever measure you want, right? It doesn't have to be all the time or whatever, because then you have, like, your first-person narrative, like, say, Book of the New Sun, or anything Gene Wolfe does, or, other people like that. But see, you decide about it. It's a strength, and leaving it completely out can be a weakness. And while John Ford is leaving part of it in, he's not doing a lot of it, which just, like, slightly tinges it into the novel side of things, while still giving us a very, very clever, like, very, like, cinematic and film-like quality, which can be really cool for the kind of story that we are reading here, because the story, as I said, is an adventure tale. It is fast-paced. It works all about these kind of things. It's all about, like, action scenes, one after the other. And that's exactly what we get here with that, like, more, like, cinematic style of writing that John Ford is providing. So yeah, wonderfully done in that regard. And now that we've done with the prose, let's look at other aspects here. And that is emulation. emulation of genre. It's something that John Ford does a lot. As I said, like the basic story that we're getting told here is an adventure story. People thrown together in a, seemingly randomly thrown together in an inn in the Alps in snow, and then traveling together, having adventures, solving, doing something crazy great because they have to do so. That's an adventure story. And John Ford plays with the aspects, those aspects, like the conventions of that genre a lot, but he also does other bits and pieces with it, or like introduces others. There's like that first chapter in the house, that house in the Alps, in like that's part 2, right? Is is very much not even a pastiche, but it's certainly poking fun at and playing with the conventions of a very specific detective novel style. When, the detective, like, brings everyone into the room after a murder and is like, one of you is the murderer, and I will now reveal and add one reveal after the other, beyond the next. It's really fun. And he does exactly that. He plays it straight in that way, and that's just fun and fantastic. And I think that's one of the secrets of this novel, is the exuberance. Like, no matter what he's doing in which part of the novel, he's always, John Ford, it always feels like he's really enjoying what he's doing. You can feel, it's hard to describe, but you can feel how much Ford is excited about what he's about to do now. How much he's just like having fun himself while writing the story that he wants to read, basically. And that's a really cool thing, because it brings us to the, like, why are people writing question that we not going to explore in detail here. But it's like there's different motives for people to write. Some people write a story because they want to tell a story to someone. Some people write a story because they want to change the world. They want to convince people of something. Some people do it as a more like therapeutic means, where they're like, what, I have suffered all kinds of things, and I need to put them out on paper to help myself, free of certain emotions and stuff. All of those are valid reasons to write a story. And this one is very much a story that feels like it's something that John Ford wanted to read and wanted to have told to someone. And it has that youthful, almost childlike excitement about it all the way through. And it's fascinating that it manages to keep that excitement going, even though it's turned decidedly mature near the end, with a lot of death and other things going on. And that's just fantastic. And I think it's one of the reasons why I enjoyed it so much, and why I think it works so well as a novel, is that excitement basically almost dripping off the page. All right, let's look at some of the other important aspects and themes here, because the novel is like split in several parts, and that's fine. But I want to look at one thing that Ford does here, and that is his character work. We get introduced with a chapter each for our main characters, except Gregory, the vampire. But we get one for Howell, the wizard. We get one for Dimi, the soldier, the mercenary, and we get one for Cynthia, the doctor. And the way these are individual, like basically almost always growing up stories about growing up and becoming who they are, and the way the things that happen to those, and they're all like fairly traumatic each one of them in their own way, right? And we see those effects like change and impact the way the characters work afterwards in a lot of ways. And I think that's something we've spoken about a lot when we spoke about Malaz, and how Stephen Erickson is paying a lot of attention on like how childhood trauma can actually impact people later on in life. And it's well executed in this case as well, because it's each of those basically one large episode in a way. That the whole like going away with the wizard part for Howell, the whole failure at saving Lorenzo de' Medici for Cynthia, and that whole things like how how that impacts her like idea of being a doctor, of medicine, of saving people while having to actually do pretty gruesome things when executing or killing or whatever you want to call it, that vampire kid and stuff like that, right? It does that in a fairly direct way. Once again, those are like almost like establishing shots for these characters in that cinematic way that Ford writes the novel, and that's really cool. It is really, really fun. And the way it is then pulled through with Hal trying to, be aware of all the dangers of magic and so forth. As I said, like, greatly, just excellently done, and also fun to read, because each of those first chapters establishes the world in like a fantastic way, right? The first chapter, Howell's chapter, introduces the part of England being what it is, and establishes the fact that, magic exists in the world, and all of that. The second chapter establishes the world, basically, right? We establish the fact that the world is basically split between England and Byzantium through the story of Dimitris Dukas in France. We get all these like backdrops in that second chapter, while still at the same time establishing a character. And then we jump to the last one, to Cynthia, when we see the threat of the Byzantine Empire to the rest of the world, and also get finally introduced to the big one. There's vampires in this world, and they're sort of accepted in some ways. And plus we see her character. That's just like, once again, this is like well done, because it's very efficient in that way. By showing us things in the background without telling us. It's perfect show don't tell in that regard when it comes to world building, because we need to pick up those aspects of the world through these things, right? Plus, all three of them obviously talk about religious pluralism, which is one of the fascinating things about this book. It's like and the first like turning point. We're gonna look at that in a second. And that is, of course, alternate history. And, alternate history is sort of weird. There's, like, alternate history that's very much about, like, exploring how the world could be with, like, one specific event gone different. And that can be fun by itself. There's people who really enjoy that kind of, like, writing alternate histories really just for the history. But ideally, you make it about more than that. Obviously, John Ford does more than that. There's like probably two, maybe even three main events that he like looks at and like changes. One of them is certainly what if Justinian could have actually kept Italy under Byzantine control when he takes it back from the Ostrogoths? Visigoths? No, Ostrogoths. The Ostrogoths, basically. What... Could that have worked or not? And like, how would the world have evolved there? And that's an interesting one, but it's not the big one. The big one in the background, and it's something that comes up again and again, and in like a very, for me, fascinating way, is the Julian case, right? So Julian the Apostate, one of those really interesting, fun emperors of Byzantine emperors, after Constantine the that guy, made Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire. And there's a lot of stuff goes on there with like different sects and heresies. There's like really strong Arianism going on at the time, and we're not going there right now. I could talk a lot about early Christian heresies, but it's not something we're here to do today. It's just something that I personally am very fond of. But what makes Julian such a fascinating character is that he tries to like pull that back and takes away the exclusivity of Christianity, and not goes into like full on Christian persecution mode. He's no Diocletian or anything like that. That I feel is an important aspect there. Instead, he's like, let everyone be religious, and then the way they want. And now this is obviously a very fascinating idea for people who are not very religious today, not very Christian or anything like that. But what you get is a climate of religious tolerance in a way that you don't normally get in the 15th century, which is exactly what we see here. Everyone's worshipping their own gods. Of course, I'm very happy to see like a lot of people, like especially the martial types, be all like into like Mithras, and we get a bit of like playing around with the Mithras cult, which is really cool shit. I know, because we don't know we don't know much about it, so we can make up a lot about it, and it's really cool, and it's just close enough to Christianity to allow for more conspiracy theories. I'm always a fan of religious conspiracies. Don't get me wrong; they're harmless, I hope. So, but having all of that, having a pantheon in every place, and is an excellent thing, because it feels like taking away religious fundamentalism or religious exclusivity from the 15th century seems to make it not necessarily a better place, but it certainly doesn't harm anyone. I feel that's something that comes across. Plus, of course, it kind of prefigures, I guess, in a way, aspects of the Renaissance, because you don't need that returning to like Rome, like cults of antiquity, even in just its aesthetic, if you just like have always kept them, and the fact that like we get like short descriptions of all those pantheons out there in like every city where they have a pantheon where all those gods are worshipped at the same time, and there's even people there's Christians out there. They're called differently, but they're out there as well. It's like, yeah, they're just like another cult, so whatever. That part, I feel, adds another dimension, because it manages to not be virulently anti-Christian, which, you want to do that, be my guest, I'm fine with it. But it doesn't do that. Instead, it's more like, hey, wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be really cool if everyone could just like pick a cult that they believe in? But it still, in a way, looks at the dangers of like where this kind of belief could go otherwise, with the whole dragon magic at the end. Because what Ford shows is, in a way, is that if that fervor isn't actually pushed into like religious exclusivity, it can like otherwise be pushed into that like national thing, when we have like all the Welsh deciding that they need to take over and take over England again, and it leads to that whole dragon idea, which pretty cool. So it's not just your like, hey, one of those things that you see with a lot of like neo-pagans or whatever, that are all like, yeah, Christianity was evil because they took away our religion. Like, yeah, that was nice, but still, it doesn't mean that we would have been that much better off without it, right? Without Christianity. And I feel to not go that like, hey, with paganism all would be well stay a step, if not going that way, not that route. Is one of the strengths of this novel that I personally really appreciated. To don't do that, in a way. So yeah. To return to my point, it is more than just an alternate history to explore history. And it's more than just another like alternate history that's like, look, the world would have been so much better if we'd all gone this other direction. Instead, it deals, like every great story should, with personal drama, with personal, like, us humans trying to pull through. And I think there's like an important thing here with all these characters, and I think John Ford's characters work marvelously well. Really, they do. And one of the reasons why they do, is that all of them are damaged in some way or another. And it may be, the whole, like, the loss of his childhood friends and all of these things, and the trust issues that come with that Demetrius has. It may be that, like, trying to find out who you really are, and if you're, like, the same person again, like that you have with Cynthia and her, feelings of having failed at her calling as a doctor, and having failed at saving her patient, that kind of trauma. It may be the way of Howell, the wizard, who's trying to not cause damage to anyone but himself, and so forth. He manages to make every single character feel damaged or flawed in some way. And at the same time send out the message that they're still good people. They're still trying to be good people. And that's the best we can do. Don't get me wrong, that's maybe not the largest of like revelations at this point in time. We're living, in the 2020s now. We have like made huge steps when it comes to, say, accepting mental health issues, for example, or neurodiversity, or all these other things that make us individuals and can lead to us sometimes not feeling perfect. We have come huge, like really far when it comes to accepting those or normalizing those things. Now, this is a book from like 1983, and to send out the message like, yes, at the end of the day, we've all gotten our cracks and scraps and whatnot over the time, and you know what? That's okay. That's what makes us human, is a message that you don't get that much of in like fantasy and science fiction novels of the early 80s. And I'm glad John Ford puts it in there this strongly, this positively, right? And it's obviously something that you can see in all kinds of other novels as well. Ford makes it a point. It's like, yeah, that's what we do. It's like we're all struggling, we're all trying to muddle through life. All we can do is improvise to the music, which I think is a wonderful image that he puts in there like several times. And like, life is basically us improvising to the music of time, basically. And that's really cool. That's a powerful image and a wonderful one, and I'm really happy for that one. So yeah, that's I guess what makes this like work as an alternate history. It's not just asking the question like how the world would be if Julian lived longer or Justinian managed to keep Italy or whatever. It's a backdrop for something. And the something is a story and exploration of human nature, not just an exploration of history. And that's what makes the best alternate history books really good. Just like, say, another one that I always recommend and really love and almost talked about, The Yiddish Policeman's Union by Michael Chabon, which also really explores something else than just what if Jews had been allowed to settle in Alaska. That's like the starting point, but that's not what the story is about. And it's something that I guess we sometimes forget when we're writing or reading fantasy or creating games. John Ford was a game designer as well. That's exactly the fact. Like, the world is not the story. The world building is not the story. We can have the coolest world if we don't have like anything like meaningful about human nature to tell within that world. We might as well not bother. And John Ford has learned that lesson. He has learned that lesson well, and he tells a human story about trying to survive in a chaotic world, trying to do the right thing, and muddle through. And it's a great story. And the setting around it, not necessarily that important. There's another interesting aspect there, and I think that reinforces that, right? And that's Byzantium. Because Byzantium is the ever-present force in this world. It's all about what Byzantium does, how the Byzantine Empire tries to take over the next country and whatnot. But we have not a single scene set in Byzantium. We never go there. It remains that large emptiness in the background, the elephant in the room that no one talks about in that regard, that it's there, it has informed the world, but we never go there. We never see how it really is. We can infer things about it. But that's all we can do. We'll never find out how John Ford's Byzantium really looks. Is it a good place? Is it a bad place? Is it the place of, the good Procopius or the bad Procopius? We don't know. And that's one of its major strengths, to leave that bit out. And that's what I mean, like, reinforce the fact that this is not a story about Byzantium, it's a story about the people that are influenced by Byzantium. And that's its one strength. And then there's one final thing that I want to talk about before we're done here. Magic and vampires. Because, this is not just an alternate history. Yes, it is an alternate history, but it's something else as well. That's a fantasy story. It has clearly fantastic elements. It has wizards in it, really cool wizards that do wizarding things. And John Ford knows his magic. It's really cool to see him have these elements where Howl Howl is performing magic and stuff like that. That's really cool stuff right there. And we have vampires. Our good buddy Gregory, who, just to make this clear, is the best vampire I've read in an adventure story. He hands down beats that annoying fuck in the Witcher stories. Rages? Yeah, that one. Gregory is the real deal. He's really cool. The way he deals with the fact that he is a vampire, doesn't necessarily want to be one. You know, the struggle within the beast is extremely well portrayed in this book, and I that's one of the things that I think it does great, because yeah, it's also a vampire story. At the same time, not necessarily what you set out to when you read this book, which is why I'm putting this in the spoiler part. But yeah, it does basically do the thing that good vampire stories, good monster stories, good horror stories can do, which is explore human nature through the the inhuman, the animal, the struggle of the beast. And there's all kinds of things you can say about vampires that we're not going to do here, but the fact that they're sort of accepted, but maybe not, and doing the things that they are doing the way they are, and him, Gregory, trying to not become that animal, eating, drinking human blood and infecting other people with its disease and all of that, and the way he's trying to not do that, and how he's struggling over time to, survive or maybe end the threat that he perceives himself to be. It's once again done in a very tender way, and I think that's like the last big bit here. That is like the tenderness that John Ford shows all his characters. Like, no one in these books feels like a bad guy in that regard. They feel, it feels like he's doing terrible things to them, but it feels like he's fond of those characters in a way that Robin Hobb manages to do it. Also, it's like the tenderness and respect that the author shows every single character here is one of the great things. But I wanted to go back to the magic aspect, because I said it's sort of what reminded me of Tim Powers, who does the same kind of thing. And there's a great important thing that adding magic and vampires to the world does to an alternate history, because it shows clearly that this is a fantastic story and prevents, in a way, the same thing that, say, your Robert E. Howard tried to prevent when he wrote in Aquilonia or like in the Hyborian Age, and did not write historical fiction. That's when you set out and write an alternate history, you will always find people that then comes like, but this change is not very logical, and you can't go that way, and you can't do that because that's very unlikely. And yes, the sheer absurdity of us debating the correct interpretation of alternate made-up histories is obviously, there, and I'm aware of it. But then, on the other hand, it is real, and that shit happens all the time. So when you put in magic, put in wizards, and put in vampires, you're like, you know what? This is a fantasy story, and if you have trouble with the way with the way my alternate history is developing, you know what? This is not science. This is imagination. This is fantasy, and you gotta deal with that. So go fuck you. That's basically what adding magic to this story can do, and it's one of its strengths as in, say, the fantastic, is that we can add magic, and if we don't explain it to the last seconds, like where the magic comes from, the one source, whatever. No, if it's like magic is there, people don't know why. It just works a bit like science, but maybe differently. But the author makes it very clear to the reader that you've left the realm of you've entered the realm of imagination, and here everything is possible. And then it's up to the reader and the writer to see how far they want to go down that road, what they are willing to imagine, what they are willing to not imagine. And John Ford goes out and has a great old time with all of that, without having to carry out any form of criticism of his historical aspects. And then he gets to play around with a Shakespeare tragedy as an action adventure with wizards and vampires that are shooting guns. And you know what? At the end of the day, that's the strength of this. It's just so much fun. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed the dragon waiting, and I'll see you for the next one. Cheers.